excited that you're here. So thank you. And we hope you have been having a wonderful conference, and we hope that this will be a great finale to the AI track here. So as Katie mentioned, my name is Tulsee, and we're really excited to talk to you today about AI and ethics. Over the course of the past 2.5 days, we've heard a lot of really exciting conversations and panels and presentations about the amazing advancements that are happening in AI, whether that's in bots and assistants, or recommendations, or self-driving cars, or social good and criminal justice. And today we're going to try and shift the conversation a little bit away from the amazing technology to what are some of the implications that actually exist when we're creating that technology? What are some of the ethical issues that we need to be discussing? So our goal today is to really spark a conversation and to raise some of these questions so that hopefully each of us can continue these conversations at our industries and institutions going forward. Because the reality is, ethics are really hard. Unlike a lot of the scientific method and technology, there really isn't a right answer. It's heavily subjective to how you approach the problem, to your values, to societal expectations. So here today, we're not necessarily going to try and provide an answer and say, here's the right thing to do, but we're going to try and open up some of the possibilities, discuss some of the issues that occur, some of the concerns, some of the pros and cons, and hopefully get you guys a little excited. In particular, these three amazing women are going to introduce themselves in a second, and we'll talk to you about a variety of things like bias in data sets or morality when artificial intelligence makes decisions. And a big part of what you're going to hear also is philosophy. Philosophy is a subject that I think we tend to ignore a lot in the world of computer science. It's old, it's been around for centuries, but these philosophers have been thinking about analytical frameworks for things like morality and rationality for decades, for centuries. And so how can we build off of what they've been thinking about to help us when we're building artificial intelligence? So with that, I'll hand it off to Omoju to introduce herself.
Thank you guys for coming. My name is Omoju Miller. I am a data scientist. I just graduated with my PhD in computer science and education from UC Berkeley. Go Bears. For 15 years now, off and on, I've been in the area of cognitive computing and understanding and studying how people reason about computation, as well as some of the social-curricular factors that affect people of color and women entering the space. One of the reasons why I got very, very interested in this subject matter was at some point in my dissertation, I started writing about the data science and its social implications. And one of our award-winning classes at UC Berkeley, yes, I'm very proud, CS10, teaches actually the social implications of computing. So it's something that we started to think about. And as AI is coming more and more mainstream, some of these things are moving out of academia and actually into people's lives.
Hi everyone, I'm Melisa. I am the youngster of the group actually. I'm a senior at Stanford University, finishing out my computer science degree. Go Cardinal, right there, I see you. And over the summer I was an APM intern at Google. That's how I got into this, talking to Tulsee. And how I got interested in the area was through a computer science class at Stanford. And I'm very glad that they had classes to introduce you, philosophy in computer science, ethics in computer science, human-computer interaction, those kind of areas as well as the more technical areas. I have always liked the technical side, but by reading books and joining that class called Ethics and AI, I also got interested in the philosophy and ethics of the space. And I'm very happy to see you all. I hope we can spark some discussions with this panel. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Maya, and I just graduated last June from Stanford, and I'm currently working as a technology analyst at Goldman Sachs in New York. So I studied at Stanford, computer science was my major, but I also minored in philosophy. And I think I definitely agree with what Tulsee was saying. Philosophy is a subject that many computer scientists sort of overlook. I think we as computer scientists are much more focused on subjects that we can think of as having empirical data and results. And I think philosophy is a tough one for computer scientists because it's a lot of abstract theorizing about things that we can't necessarily see the effects of right now, and we don't necessarily know if they're correct answers. But at the same time, I think, so specifically what I studied was contemporary philosophy and philosophy of action. And I think contemporary philosophy is definitely very relevant to computer scientists because it has a lot of applications in normativity, which is basically how we are supposed to behave, what we ought to do, how we ought to build machines that interact with humans. And I think this is definitely something that we should take into consideration when we're building AIs today and for the future.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess to kind of top it off, as Katie mentioned, I'm a product manager at Google, and I specifically work on recommendations for YouTube. So thinking about even in a smaller, less human life specific case recommendations, I think I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning in my daily life. I also studied both computer science and philosophy at Stanford and spent a quarter at Oxford diving specifically into the philosophy of AI. So this is a subject that's particularly exciting, I think, for all of us to bring to you guys today. So the way we're going to do this is I'll ask these guys some questions and we'll have some discussion up here, and then with about 15 minutes to go, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and we'd love to get your perspectives, your questions, or just your thoughts or your opinions about some of the things you've heard here, because a lot of this, as I think we've been mentioning, is about growing the discussion. So before we jump into some specific questions, I'd like to just throw out to the group, why is it important for us to be thinking about AI and ethics? What kind of issues do we need to consider? What examples have come up for you guys personally?
So the first one that came up to me, the reason why I really got into it was around the myth of black criminality. Like why does that thing persist? Like why is it there? And there's actually an origin of the invention of that idea, and it was around the use of statistics. And we think of statistics as unbiased, it's just, it's data sets, it's statistics, it has no intentions. But the ideas around why certain data sets are collected get encoded into what kinds of data sets are collected. So after the end of the Civil War in the United States and African Americans became full citizens, then they started counting, the country had to do a new census. And so for the first time, they're counting people who historically were not part of the data sets. And because of all the vestiges of slavery and the desire for the South to persist that, they came up with all the different kind of ways around policing black people's behavior. And so that they invented this myth of criminality, and to justify the myth, you have to collect data on it. So if somebody is literally like hanging out on the corner, just like having a quick chit chat, and you ask them like, are you employed? And they're like, no, I'm not employed. You can actually arrest that person and say, oh, that person is guilty of loitering, and throw them in jail. And so they enter your data sets for like petty, silly crimes. So over time, it builds up into this massive data set that you can actually prove statistically that certain demographics of the population have a higher disposition towards criminality. And that still carries all the way through to today, because now we have AI in the civics environment, and we're using it to do predictive policing, and we're still using those data sets that are highly skewed. This really became something very poignant to me because of stop, search, and frisk that was happening in New York City. So if you happen to be 18-year-old and below, and you were brown or black, you were going to be stopped at least one time in your life by the police. And it doesn't make any sense. Every single black and brown Latino youth in Manhattan could not be a criminal. But that's what the data set would show.
Well, first of all, I really think that ethics is important even when AI doesn't exist. We constantly wonder what's right and wrong according to who, and how should we structure out our values. But now, every day, and it already has, AI permeated our lives. So thinking about that, how many of you used Siri today, at least once? Well, clearly Siri needs to do better. How many of you called an Uber yesterday or today when you were going to somewhere? Exactly. Google Maps, when I'm coming from my 5 minutes away hotel, even though I know the way, I still look to check. So it's already everywhere, and I think that with the existence of AI and how much it permeated our lives, ethics becomes a new question. And how should we change our understanding of ethics with the existence of AI in our lives? It's very important, and that's what got me into this space.
So I think the thing that initially got me into this space is the classic philosophy problem, the trolley problem. Have any of you heard of that? Yeah. So basically the idea is, So this idea can sort of be extended to self-driving cars, and in that space it's presented as you have a self-driving car which is on a bridge and it's headed for a collision. It can either swerve into the right lane and kill the occupants of that car, or it can swerve into the left lane and kill the occupants of the other car. And in that split second, the AI of that self-driving car has to make a decision of which car to swerve and hit into. And it can do that based on things like who the occupants of the car are, how many occupants are in each car, what are the ages of those occupants, and there's all of these other features that it looks to determine what is the ethical decision to make. So it's not an abstract thing that AIs will have to make ethical decisions in the future. It's something that's already here, not just in self-driving cars, but like Omoju said, in the criminal justice system where AIs are used for predictively policing and also for determining things like sentencing. So it's really something that is not a thing of the future, but is something that's already here right now. And as such, we need to have these conversations to determine how exactly do these AIs make ethical decisions? What informs them in these cases?
Thanks. Let's dig in a little bit, Omoju, to what you were talking about around data sets in the criminal justice system. So, in general, our world is populated with years of history and millions of data points. However, examples like the one Omoju just brought up, and also other commercial examples like Microsoft Tay or Beauty.ai have showcased the bias that is inherent in real-life data sets, right? Microsoft Tay was called out for racist commentary, and Beauty.ai, after training on a whole bunch of beauty contest data sets, eventually determined that fairer skin was more beautiful. So how should we approach and think about this kind of bias? Is it our responsibility to correct this bias, and is it ethical to do so? Omoju, do you want to start?
It's absolutely ethical to do so. So for some people, they might feel like, oh, it's not such a big deal. It's not such a big deal. It's a beauty contest. I'll bring it home to something that is even much more benign. Pokemon Go. How many people have heard of Pokemon Go? Okay. So Pokemon Go was built on top of Google Maps and all the places that people have already put on Google Maps. So that meant that for a large chunk of the population, there were not enough Pokestops in certain kind of neighborhoods, especially low-income neighborhoods, because just Google Maps proliferated by human beings actually helping to map the entire world. And it took a while to get into certain kind of places, and it's still not as data rich in certain demographics. So that means that when you build on top of that data set, you're coding all those absences into that data set. So as a result, if you live in a certain kind of neighborhood, there might not be enough Pokestops. And it may seem like, okay, it's not the end of the world. But if you are addicted to Pokemon Go, as many people are, you will wander off into a neighborhood that might not be as welcoming. And that can actually be very lethal if you happen to be perceived as a criminal. So you might then wander off into a neighborhood where they're like, oh my God, who are these hordes of black kids? And they have their phones and their hoodies. Oh my God, the apocalypse. You know, this is the challenge. And we actually can correct it. It becomes an ethical question whether we want to correct it, because when we correct data sets, we can correct it to reflect our ideals and our intentions. So the Beauty.ai data set, we can make sure that we've curated enough images that give a fair representation of all the images of women around the world. That one has no bias in it if we do that. However, that means that we then decide we are God, and we then decide what is fair and what is ideal. And oftentimes, those are not cultural universals. They don't generalize well. What we may think is beautiful here might not be the same thing as what's beautiful in Uganda, may not be exactly the same thing as what's beautiful in Sri Lanka.
So I agree with you. I think it is our responsibility to correct the bias, and especially the training data. But however, I see cases that this might display hardship, or it might not work, and let's talk about those examples. So Tulsee and I were actually talking about an article this morning that displays a Facebook page of a Trump supporter and a Hillary supporter side by side, right? And now that all the algorithms that we have in these websites, in these platforms like social media, learn what you're searching for and what you like to read and give you more of that, more and more. So one of the hardships is, for example, this situation. If you are a Hillary supporter, you keep getting these articles and keep reading more and more, and your belief at a certain point becomes a lot more polarizing with someone who supports, against someone who supports Trump. So such an algorithm, for example, is opening the gap between these two groups, and there's no way of you seeing that perspective unless you look at a social media news feed of a Trump supporter. The other problem is, again, with the search rankings, right? When we search for something, how do we give results? Do we present both sides of the argument, 50-50? Is that the fair one? Or do we make the results come along proportionately to the population that supports that idea? Like, for example, let's say that 99% of the population supports vaccination, vaccinating our kids against flu or against different diseases. 1% doesn't. Do we even show that 1%, or do we go for 99% because scientific data shows that we should vaccinate our kids? Or do we just put to the top search ranking position the most paid article, basically through ads? Is that the ethical one? But then you could argue that we are only representing those who can afford to pay for the ads, right? That's another issue. And one thing that I also like to bring up is, do we even do this to people? Because AI is not the only platform, especially these days, making racist, misogynistic comments. It happens in politics a lot, as you all know. Do we correct that bias? Is that our responsibility to change the people who are speaking about those? Maybe, but I'm not sure. I think that it's our responsibility to say it's wrong if we think it's wrong. But at the end, we don't wipe those people off the face of the earth because we respect freedom of speech. So these kind of things, I think, are also important when we're thinking about correcting bias, how we're correcting it, or whether it's ethical to implement certain rules that would go with the AI. Like, for example, we can say that we want all AI to respect this one rule, that all human lives are equal, right? Because we all agree on that, because otherwise it would create existential threat to humanity, and it would harm humans, the consequences of an AI that doesn't respect such fact. But about other facts that are more related to societal norms, like, let's say, beauty, or what we think of abortion or not, or what we think of education, how to go about education. Can we create that one rule to put into AI? I don't think so. So these kind of questions are definitely the things also we should consider when we're deciding whether we can correct bias and how we can correct bias and in which areas.
That's a good point. I think the other thing to remember is that bias is not something that's stable. It's something that's constantly changing, both over time and across cultures. I mean, 50 years ago, most people believed in this country that women shouldn't be able to vote, and now I think pretty much everyone agrees that that's not really the right decision. So if we do sort of have a responsibility to correct bias in AIs, then how do we do that in a way that is stable and in a way that is self-correcting? How do we inject some sort of bias control in these AIs so that it's constantly monitoring what the society values, especially the society that it's placed in? It might be different across different societies. And how does the AI learn what it's supposed to correct for based on what that society believes?
Actually, Maya, that is an interesting question, and I'll throw that kind of back towards you guys. As our society continues to change and more people come online, more women, more developing countries, etc., are there ways that we can ensure that we aren't maintaining the same biases, and that how can we improve this process?
I think it's very, as we have in this conversation, it's suddenly occurs to me that the way we actually write AI algorithms themselves already have all these things built into it. We have like a regularization parameter to correct for certain kind of things. When our data sets are unbalanced, we oversample to make sure that they're balanced. Translating that into reality, we owe a moral duty to make sure that everybody is represented on the web, because ultimately the web is what generates most of our data sets. So if we're making sure that most of the world is active on the web itself and that their data can be freely curated, that really helps us. It becomes much more difficult if the web is monitored. For example, if your idea, there are certain people in certain countries, because the internet is very nascent to them, that literally think that the World Wide Web is Facebook. They don't understand that there's a web outside of Facebook. So if you're sitting within Facebook, then Facebook owns all that data. They don't necessarily have to share it with other platforms. So it's almost like we need some kind of rule, universal rule about almost like an international treaty, space station-like thing around who owns data, and the data is just a thing that is owned by everybody, but is not owned by a corporation.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a large part of the world that's not on the internet, and we are doing all of ourselves a disservice by not collecting that data, by not utilizing that data in our AIs when they're making decisions. I think I wanted to bring up another point that related back to Tulsee's question about how AIs make decisions in different societal contexts. So we talked earlier about how we have to examine the bias in the training data as AIs are used in different societies and cultural norms. But we also have to sort of examine how AIs make decisions in different societal contexts. So for example, consider an AI that's used to sort of monitor a newsfeed type of application where users can post little messages or tweets or posts or whatever. And this AI has a responsibility to determine whether a particular user's post can be construed as threatening or potentially dangerous to others in society. And if it does, then it has the obligation to report that particular user's information to the government or some central authority. So if that AI is placed in a society which has a much stronger central government control and less value for individual freedom of speech or expression or belief or user privacy, then the confidence interval that the AI requires when making a decision whether a particular user's post can be perceived as threatening is much lower than when that same AI should be used in a different society where we have a much higher premium on users' privacy and freedom of expression. So I think AIs definitely do need to be tweaked when they're placed in different societal contexts, whether that's countries or different time periods, or just based on what the culture values at the time.
So, for example, about that, you actually reached out a very good point. So how do we make AI more diverse too, so they can apply to different societies, right? So I almost look at it from two different points. I call it vertical and horizontal. And when it's vertical, you can basically refresh your data sets, so it like applies to time, right? As our biases change, you can also change the data sets. However, there's also this horizontal side that applies to different societies, basically including about different ethical frameworks, about including different people's perspectives. That's a lot harder. So there are two different ways that we could focus on about this. One, Omoju already mentioned, tapping into those data coming from that half of the world that we constantly disregard. And one of the reasons for that is because majority of the world is actually offline currently. So one thing we can try is try to get them online. And since that's a little bit more of a long-term project, in the meantime, trying to use the data they're currently creating on their mobile phones. So for example, I'm from Turkey, and I also lived in India for 2 years. And everywhere I went, even in offline areas, I saw people having mobile phones and being constantly on social media platforms and talking on the phone, texting. That's a data point that says something about their perspective and cultures, about the things they want to contribute to. And Omoju touched upon that. So it's very important to have that data in our data sets. And secondly is in creation of AI. Do we want an AI that is only created by a certain group, or do we want everyone's contribution to AI? So I don't know, most of you can be familiar with OpenAI by Elon Musk. So basically, that Elon Musk also advocates for. So basically what they're saying is that let's get AI to a certain point, let's improve it, be better than everyone, and then open it up to all these crowds so they can contribute. So AI grows as a product of the whole community rather than one specific portion of the world. But that sounds like a good idea. However, I do believe that there's a problem with that too. Who can contribute to the AI? Only those who got education in computer science, only those who can understand how to contribute to AI, only those who know about the existence of AI. So there's still problems of reaching out to everyone, especially in creating the AI, but I think it's a good place to start to increase the diversity in the construction of AI platforms.
I want to piggyback on that one because I was actually at the conference 2 weeks ago talking about ethics and safety. And one of the challenges with that is you open, the AI grows, it advances, and you make it open source. There is a big federal challenge for nations because at some point, somebody is going to weaponize the AI. And so people are deeply concerned that we should think of this knowledge as almost like a nuclear weapon. And it's something that should be policed and controlled. But then the question becomes, who gets to decide who is morally good to be able to consume the knowledge? And my view is that I would rather take my risk on humanity, thinking that overall we are better than being bad, and that if the AI is open, even if it's weaponized, if it's an open AI system, there will be good people in this world who understand it and who can counteract the effects of people who are using it for malicious intent.
This is super interesting, but I'm going to move a little bit beyond data sets so that we can cover some other points. But I totally encourage you guys to come and ask more questions about this and discuss this more towards the later half of this talk. Maya mentioned a little bit about the decisions that AIs make beyond the fact the data sets themselves. And these decisions are made based on a set of moral principles and values that we have. Most AIs are starting to get into this field more and more, right? So should a robot nurse provide medication or even something as extreme to euthanasia to a patient who's asking for it? Should a nanny provide a kid with medicine even if the parents don't approve? Should a self-driving car save its passenger while putting someone else at risk? So how should we be thinking about the decision-making abilities of AI? Maya, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I absolutely believe that this is specifically where computer science has something to learn from philosophy. And I think specifically what it is I believe that AIs should be imbued with some sort of ethical framework. So what is an ethical framework? It's basically just a set of rules and guidelines that we can judge every action or decision against. And by that yardstick, we can determine whether it's good or bad in the moral sense, or ethical or not ethical, and whether we should even take that action or choose not to take that action. And there's many different kinds of ethical frameworks, and this also differs again from culture to culture. There's differences in what we value from Eastern and Western cultures, and there's so many other differences, both historical and contemporary. But specifically, a couple of the ethical frameworks that I think we wanted to talk about today were utilitarianism and deontology. And Melissa, do you want to start off?
I'll start with utilitarianism. So let's first talk about what it is. Utilitarianism was first coined by Jeremy Bentham, and you can think of that ethical framework as the sum of all pleasure as a consequence of an action and minus all the suffering. And then afterwards it was also developed by John Stuart Mill by taking into consideration the quality of the pleasure and not only quantity. So when we think about that, we can think about the well-being of the majority. So this kind of framework especially works works with decisions related to the government, related to government services. Like for example, let's say tax systems, right? How do we want to restructure a tax system for our society? Generally, what we should do is to benefit the majority, right? If there's a certain group of people who are being taxed but cannot pay for it, and they constitute the majority of people or like a big part of the community, that's not a good system. So, or how to go with education, right? Should we create only certain schools that have access to massive amount of resources that only benefit a very small group of people? Or should we improve our education system to benefit the majority using the ethical framework of utilitarianism? So in these kind of examples like education, tax systems, where to build bridges, roads, utilitarianism that advocates for the well-being of the majority for the greater good definitely works the best. And second is deontology.
Yeah, so I think the main thing about utilitarianism is that it really has to deal with the consequences of the action that you decide on. And sometimes that doesn't work out so well. It makes sense in really clear-cut cases, like if you have that self-driving car faced with a trolley problem situation, and it has to either crash into a bus full of school children or one elderly man. Well, in that case, according to utilitarianism, it would probably choose to crash into the one old man. Yes, sadly. And maybe even that's not so clear-cut, but it makes sense in situations like that. But consider a robot that works in the field of healthcare, and this robot has its goal every day of maximizing the well-being of all of its patients. And it does that by taking good care of them, making sure they take their medicine, do all of their physical therapy and everything. And one day this robot is going about its routine and it encounters a patient who says that they don't want to take their medication that day. They refuse to take their medication. So here the AI is faced with an ethical decision. They can either force the patient to take their medication, or they can respect their autonomy and allow them not to, knowing full well that it might make them sicker. And you can see that really the option that utilitarianism would choose in terms of maximizing well-being of the patients would be to force them to take their medication. But in some ways it seems like something fundamental has gone wrong in that situation, and that's that the person's autonomy and humanity is not being respected. So it seems like we really need an ethical framework for AIs which forces them to respect humanity as an end in itself. And so that's where deontology comes in. Deontology basically just means that we can judge actions by their adherence to a particular rule or set of rules. And one of the most famous rules was developed by Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher in the 18th century. And he basically said that this rule that we can sort of measure every single action by is we can see whether the principle that you're about to act on can be formulated as a universal maxim. So how does that work in practice? Well, say, for example, that I'm about to make a promise to a friend that if she lends me something now, then I'll definitely pay her back later. And I think, well, maybe this would be a good situation to lie in, because if she lends me money now, then I really don't have to pay her back later. I could just lie and pretend like I'm totally going to. But if we formulate this principle as a universal maxim, so that would be like saying, in every situation where a person is faced with the opportunity to lie for their personal gain and break a promise, then they would do so, then we can see that the world in which we envision that universal maxim to exist in kind of falls apart because there are logical contradictions. And what would those logical contradictions be? Well, there's the idea that if everyone goes around breaking their promises, then no one's really going to trust promises. So kind of the concept of promises as a whole just falls apart. So in that way, we can judge any action we're about to take by following these steps. One, formulate it as a universal maxim. Two, see whether the world in which that universal maxim exists has any logical contradictions. And three, if it doesn't, then proceed with the action. And this seems like a pretty good plan for an AI, because as you can see, there's nothing in this ethical framework that's special to humans. It doesn't require humanity, it doesn't require empathy, it doesn't require the capacity for love or consciousness or any of those other things that make humans special. And in fact, in some ways, it seems like an AI might be better at being ethical in the Kantian sense than a human. And that's because, well, an AI could have infinite computing resources. They could actually simulate a possible world in which everyone is acting on this universal maxim. And in this way, they could empirically determine what is moral and what is not moral, which is much better than a human could do, just speculating, is there a logical contradiction? Maybe, not really sure.
Well, on that point, I actually have a question for you. So when we talk about AI, obviously we're talking about different types of AI, right? Artificial narrow intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and artificial super intelligence. So on that note, and there are very pessimistic and optimistic views about that, and there are diagrams that show us that we're going to be soon there to artificial super intelligence, and we won't even understand what's coming. So on that point, how would you approach to the question that if we were to get an artificial super intelligence and such an intelligence that has the capability of everything and being a lot more exponentially more intelligent than humans, if it were to decide that it doesn't want to follow that framework, because it would be able to.
Right, so theoretically it would have the ability to make the decision not to follow an ethical framework it was initially imbued with. But I think the idea of having some sort of super intelligence is a little bit more complicated than that, because when something does reach that level of intelligence, it also tends to have a stability of values. I mean, if you look at humans, we don't suddenly have a set of values one day and wake up the next morning and decide, no, I don't like any of those values, I'm going to change it completely. I guess as a thought experiment, if we took like Gandhi, for example, and he generally has a principle that he doesn't want to harm other humans, but if he had the opportunity to take a pill that would make him want to harm other people, he probably wouldn't. And that's because his current beliefs make him not want to take that action that would change his beliefs. And so I'm not sure why a super intelligence would be different in that respect.
I think it will be very, very different because human intelligence often is linear. So even the thought experiment and the way we're thinking linearly and we're thinking of consequences in a linear fashion. It's very, very hard for us to imagine and reason about exponential possibilities. So we are just limited by the thing in our head. The artificial superintelligence can think in exponential dimensions. So basically, we are at its mercy. So if we can somehow imbue it with the core of our humanity, things that are ephemeral, things that are like love, things that literally make us human, perhaps then it can actually create a world in which those things flourish even more. But I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about that. I think I'm more concerned about the present things that will evolve in the next 5 years, and I just hope for the best with artificial superintelligence.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And on that point, I really love playing the devil's advocate. And even when we're thinking about linearly, one could say that, for example, going off of your Gandhi example, the majority of the world respects his values and ethics. But on the other hand, one could also argue that his decision to abstain from food or living his life in a certain way was actually harming the closest ones to him, like his family. Like, there's a movie about his son as well, how much he hated him. So it's all about perspective. It's like how the majority maybe respects the ethics of one person, or we think that the ethical values exist. But it's also important to realize that there are people who not necessarily have good ethical values, or they are too fluid.
So I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic on this front. And I think that, we have computers today, AIs, that can beat humans at chess, that can beat humans at Jeopardy, that can beat humans at Go. I think in the future, why shouldn't we have AIs that can beat humans at being ethical?
So I think here's something interesting is we're talking about super intelligence and AI is getting more and more complex, right? So, with a lot of even the algorithms we're creating today, it's actually very hard for us to debug them and actually understand, how they're learning to use the features that they're using, like how they're learning to make the decisions. And a lot of the frameworks and what you're talking about also with being able to have a machine that is ethically better than us, rely on us actually being able to understand the ethics of the machine, right? So I guess how important is transparency in how the model works, right? So are there things that we should be doing here? Are there particular machine learning algorithms that are better suited for these kind of frameworks than others? Is this limited to a particular type of machine learning?
Well, the EU has decided it's very, very important, and they passed a law. I think it's by 2018, all pieces of software or any kind of computational substrate that uses an AI in it must have a model that is interpretable. The model has to be able to justify how it came to its conclusions. Now, 2018 is it's 24 months. And the question is, most people, the models that most people are using that most people are deeply excited about, often is deep learning. We don't know how to quite interpret them yet. And I don't know if somehow we're just gonna magically, in 24 months, solve everything. And so I think what's going to happen is people are just going to hack it, and they'll be like, oh, tell us how you came to this decision, and we'll just create some kind of decision tree and be like, if this person is this, say this, if this person is that, say that. But I think it's very, very important that we have interpretable models. Even if it's not perfectly interpretable, at least give us pointers in the general direction of the reasoning. Otherwise, black box models are very, very hard for people to build trust in. And trust is almost the most important factor in adoption of these things in our lives. We use Siri all the time on Google Maps. It's not really lethal. But when it comes to things like having the AI doctor or the AI nurse or the AI babysitter, building trust with the parent or the people using it is a big one. And often the way you build trust is by being able to reason about why you came to your conclusions.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that right now some AI or some ML algorithms are much more suited for being transparent than others. Like we can see that with decision tree models, it's much easier to see how they arrived at their answer versus with neural nets, which are much more opaque, and it's hard to see exactly how they arrived at that decision. And that's going to be so important when these AIs are making decisions that really have lifelong consequences and that really affect other humans' lives. And so transparency is definitely something that's important, but at the same time, we don't want to sacrifice the complexity of the model just because we need to have transparency.
So maybe it can be a gradation, like we'll put things like, oh, this is not that important. I don't care how my Roomba makes the decision to vacuum the room. It's really not, I don't care, so I don't care if it uses a black box model. But maybe I care about how this AI bot that is trading, high frequency trading, is making its decisions. Maybe I care about the ones that's doing predictive policing or things like that. So maybe we'll just have like grades of what's really important and what is not. And even the deep models, I don't think that they're completely quite opaque. I think we can extract out some very, very fuzzy rules because often they're built on the models of human reasoning. And even human reasoning is not quite there yet, and for us even justifying what we, especially with polls, like you ask people, how are you gonna vote? They'll tell you something, then they go vote something else. So human reasoning is not bulletproof, but at least there's some general guidelines. And I think this question goes deeper into, the ultimate question is, should we limit the expansion and development of AI to human intelligence? Because that's basically, we're all scared, so we're trying to make it tell us what it's doing.
Well, I think one thing there is whether or not we limit AI to the limits of human intelligence. Should we have? How important is it for us to have power and control over these situations, right? So, are there ever situations where we should override the decisions that AI are making, whether that's a robot that's cleaning your room or a larger problem? And if so, like, what are some of those cases? What are some of the things that we should be really scared about? I guess.
Ex machina?
So I think something that Omoju brought up earlier is AIs, at least so far, we can't really imbue them with things that are very central to humans. We can't give them a sense of love, we can't give them a sense of empathy, we can't allow them to really feel a connection with another human or entity. And I think because of that, AIs will miss something fundamental when making particular kinds of decisions. So if we do have an AI, for example, that's determining sentencing in criminal court cases, it can't, because it doesn't have that sense of empathy, it can't take a chance on a person, even if it's fully aware of the situation of how the person committed the crime, why they committed the crime, exactly what their family life situation is like, everything about that person's life. Even if they know all of that information, they still can't just have the sense that maybe this person will turn their life around and I'm going to take a chance on them and give them a much shorter sentence. So there's really no sense for them to sort of spontaneously overturn what their model says they should do.
I think another example that would agree with that is also hiring, right? We basically don't only hire people, or we don't get hired based on just a list of accomplishments or paper, but it's also about the spark that you're giving to the person you're talking to, or like the energy you're getting, or the trust you have that person to learn more very rapidly in a very short period of time, especially for recent grads, right? Coming out of college, how many skills do you have? But most people take that chance when they see the spark or the energy that you are able to learn a lot in a short period of time. And I think such a case would be added to what you were talking about, that AI might not be fully able to decide.
And Omoju, before you start talking, after Omoju provides her point, we're actually going to start taking questions from the audience. There's a mic in the middle of the room, so
Yeah, we can actually just take questions now.
yeah, or we can start taking questions now. So if you could go to the mic in the middle, then we'll just start fielding questions from there.
Hey, lovely ladies.
Hello.
Is that good?
A little bit.
So my question is, when AI is getting more and more smart.
Sorry, do you mind coming closer to the mic?
Yeah.
Or maybe just take it off and then pass it over. Yeah.
Is it done?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So my question to you is, when AI is getting smarter day by day, and we are talking about super intelligence, situations like military actions, AI will also play some roles there. And having ethical AI over there, the most ethical thing would be having peace all over. How AI is going to respond to such situation when people are fighting with each other, and then I'm sure going forward there will be robots and AI putting together, working on all these together. How your ethical things will come from that? How do you train such situation?
I honestly think that there won't be a cultural one. It won't be like, oh, we have the United Nations AI. I think it's each nation is going to imbue their piece of AI with its own ethics, and it will maximize the ethics of the country in which it serves. So you have your AI army who works for the United States and is serving United States ideals. And then they'll have one for their own country, serving their country's ideals, and will just perpetuate the humanness that we already have.
Basically, like, think about what happens right now, right? We have governments, so the rules we pass in the United States is completely different than the laws we pass in Turkey, because it both reflects the perspective of its own people and what they want to see in the future. So I think that the solution, as I agree with Omoju, would be such a thing that AI would come out of each nation, respecting the perspective, cultures, and societal norms.
Hello. So my question kind of plays off the last question that we answered before the questions. But you talked about how, in the hiring process, you might want to override an AI's decision because you see a spark in someone, or in the sentencing process to give them a second chance. But then with humans, you also get that bias in the hiring process. So how do you kind of see AIs and humans working together to take that totally objective opinion and the human's possibly biased opinion to come to some sort of decision?
So I think commonality was we let the AIs make their decisions, and we sort of override it only when the overwritten decision benefits the human in the situation that it's dealing with. So I think that's a really good question. It definitely is a difficult balance to find out when do we let the AI take over and when do we respect their decision as a better one. How do we know that by overriding it we're not making the worst decision? But I think it's safe to say that in the case where the overridden decision helps the human that it's dealing with more than the AI's decision, then maybe overriding it is the safe thing to do.
Hello, friends. My question is more along the lines of data collection and the discussion about data sets being inherent, being biased due to the way it's collected or how researchers were thinking about collecting that data. And the rhetoric seemed to revolve around, oh, only if we had more data, or like if we could get rid of the response bias, maybe we could get a little bit closer to a more objective view of the data set we're looking at. And in the second half, as we were talking about how that data is collected, and a little more discussion kind of moved toward like, oh, inherently when we collect that data, it is more biased. My question is, if we were able to get rid of all response bias and able to do censuses on whatever we wanted to collect, what methods or ways of thinking about collecting that data can we use to reduce overall amount of bias?
So, okay, it's a great question. I think like we actually talked about some of the ways, and one important thing was not only increasing the amount of data, but almost diversity of the data. And there are like different ways of doing it, especially for different cultures, right now that are not exactly online or like have an online existence in certain platforms. So one thing I think could have been done right now, actually going to those communities by also being like respecting their cultures, trying to learn about their perspectives, about certain areas that we are trying to address with the AI. We were talking about this today, how we can collect data from the communities that don't have any voice at the moment, but I think it is a more, it is a longer and more, a process that will require more effort, just because there's nothing that we can just submit and have the data online, but it will require actually people going and working there and understanding those people and how to contribute their values and ethics into the AI systems and platforms.
I guess just to make sure I'm getting that point, what I'm understanding from your response is essentially the way we get the information that we can get through data is by going to those communities and truly empathizing with the kind of people we're trying to solve problems for. Okay, sounds good.
And also one of the biggest things, even around the creation of the data sets, is we have the capacity to log almost anything. In an enterprise environment, you can log whatever it is you want to log. But even though its storage is very, very cheap, we still don't log everything, because the data scientist has to decide what are the most important things that I want to even log. So having multiple different kinds of people answer the question of what are the metrics that we want to capture, so that it's not just people from Stanford and Berkeley that decide what the metrics that we capture are. We should have people from other places as well determine what the metrics are, and then we can have a more comprehensive logging system, so that whenever we want to ask a question, we actually have the data. That's one of the biggest challenges, is what are we even storing?
And I guess to also make sure that I'm also getting this point that you're making right now. The way I understand this is that to truly harness the kind of information that we're getting from specific data sets is to train AI on specific problems that we're trying to solve. And maybe the aggregate of all of these different types of trained AIs could actually be a better sum than just a general AI can be trained on everything.
Oh, this doesn't even get to AI. This is human beings logging data that then AI trains on. Yeah. This is not even getting to the, it's literally just, the AI has to train on some data.
Yes.
But what is the data? Often it's human beings that make decisions, write in SQL, and log in things to grow data sets. Or they hire a team and say, go create a data set for me. It's the question that those people ask, and that's then they build a data set for you. But then you're limited on the questions you can ask based on what they decided to log. So having a truly diverse team building the logging system is absolutely fundamental.
Thank you.
I think we have probably time for one more question.
Hi, I have a question about ethical frameworks, but I'll go into a bit of background about what I'm specifically asking. So, one of the main successes in recent times with AI was AlphaGo, which is a program that, for people who don't know, was the first program to beat the world's best Go player. And it's a game that's much more complex than chess. But when we look at the type of games and things we've been training AI on, we've been getting AI to work really well within a framework that we've created, and that's where we've had a lot of success. Whereas when we're looking at ethical questions, we want the AI to develop the framework itself. So the question is, when we have ethical frameworks as humanity, we have significant disagreement about which ethical framework is ethical, because often they completely disagree, especially the two that you talked about, utilitarianism and the one I forget the name of.
Deontology.
Yeah, deontology. Those two are often in complete opposition. So when we're training our AI, it might be more ethical in a sense than humans, because a lot of human behavior isn't ethically consistent with itself. So what do we do when the AI trains from those different things and we don't feel comfortable with the judgment that it makes, even if it's technically more ethical?
I think that is a great question. And I think the idea I was proposing earlier, sort of that at some point, like you said with AlphaGo, eventually perhaps AIs could be humans at being ethical, whatever that would look like. It probably will have to do with them making ethical decisions that we wouldn't ordinarily make on our own, because potentially some consequence that they foresee like 20, 30 years down reveals to them that this other decision is really the more ethical one to take. And I think maybe in the future that's something we have to get comfortable with, that oftentimes the decision that an AI makes as ethical is not what we intuitively would have made on our own. Or maybe there is something in that sense that I'm not comfortable with that decision. And maybe that is something that is potentially unique to humans and might be much harder to build into an AI, that sense of not being comfortable with the decision in an ethical sense. And I think there is work to be done on specifically identifying where that feeling is coming from and trying to see if we can build machines that are a little bit more empathetic, a little bit more perhaps human-like when making decisions.
And what do we do now, right? Like, because there's so many conflicting views on ethical frameworks. We go with one as a society, even though let's say you agree with everyone over here who picked one ethical framework, and let's say you're the right one, like your view is the right. What happens is that we go with it and see, and it doesn't work, and then we try to fix it. We try to find the better one and go. That's what we have been also trying to emphasize, that as things are changing, since things are fluid, especially in ethics and throughout the societies, we try, we make it better, we fix it, we try to improve it at all times. So it's almost like the same what we're trying to do now in different platforms. In politics, yes, we wait maybe 6-7 years and then try to pick a better person who would represent us, right? So I think it will be the same with AI, but hopefully we can shorten that period of fixing things with computers.
Thank you, ladies.
And thank you guys all so much for your questions and for your patience. We hope that with this panel we've been able to at least convince you that this is a set of really interesting things to talk about, and hard but really important questions. So we'll be around, definitely come say hi or talk to us if you have more questions. And would love to hear more from you guys about your thoughts on ethics and AI going forward.
Thank you.